Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. Schools are reopening and teachers are returning to the classrooms to prep. Many parents, however, are questioning what learning will look like this fall and if it's actually worth it to send their children back to school. With most students across Canada out of school since March due to COVID, parents have been working from home and have had to adapt. The adjustment has been a challenge, and as such, parents are eagerly waiting the reopening of schools. But what will learning look like this fall? In some provinces and some grade levels, masks are mandatory for students. Social distancing is de rigueur, and schooling might be reduced part-time in your province. So how will all this work? How will students and staff be kept safe, and will they actually learn in this environment? Well, joining me now to share their thoughts and insights into back to school during COVID is Dr. Scott Masson and Peter Stock of Homeschool.today. Peter, usually the return to school is an exciting time for parents and students, but how much excitement is there this year given what's going on?
Well, I think it's actually turned to trepidation, maybe even fear on the part of some parents. Things aren't so good in the school system. Perhaps the government hasn't thought through the consequences of the actions they're taking, and parents are left with a lot of uncertainty this year, and that's leading to parents considering a lot of alternatives to the public system.
And Scott, what are your thoughts on this? Are you excited with your kids to send them back, or would you feel a lot of your friends and family are a little more nervous this year?
I have not yet met anyone who's excited about the prospect of going back to school. Not yet. I'm sure there must be somebody, but perhaps just because they're operating on the faint hope that things might somehow be better than the horror that they're in right now. But in general, I think nobody is looking forward to it, in part because there's no certainty about what is in fact coming. And because of that, people's anxieties are naturally heightened. And again, I think that's on multiple fronts. It's not just the schooling, it's the effect on home life, it's the effect on their working life, it's effect on all these things. There are so many interlocking pieces here that to create chaos in the school system is to spill over into all the other ones. So no, I don't think anyone's excited about the prospect, and everyone is exceedingly anxious, in fact.
And Scott, to further expand on that, I mean, we're seeing some schools return only to a part-time delivery method or delivery model, or every other day, reduced class hours. It's not your typical school day as people had previously experienced. So how does this education delivery impact working parents, I wonder, those either whether they're working from home or working out of the home?
Well, I would have thought it makes it impossible for them to commit to working, and it would create anxiety or a concern amongst the employers whether their employees can actually show up for work. And so it creates chaos all over the place. This policy is terrible. It's happening everywhere. There seems to be very few who are saying we're just going to go back to education as it was and go with it. Everyone is going, we're going to change this without considering the effect of changing the education delivery model on all the other things. And then in terms of the education delivery model, if you were trying to give the best possible education to your child, is this what you would do? Or would this be the very last thing you would do? I would have thought it would be the latter. It's not just in the middle. This is the last thing you would ever want to do to a child to educate.
And Peter, you know, you're involved with Homeschool.today. You're dealing with a lot of homeschool families. Pre-COVID, many families, people forget about the homeschoolers, but many families were engaged in home education. But how are the homeschoolers impacted with the return to school this fall and with their programs in general?
Yeah, it is a real challenge, probably on two fronts. One is that a lot of the outside the home activities that homeschoolers typically would have engaged in are unavailable for various reasons. Museums are closed, or field trips can't happen, and sports teams can't play, and those sorts of things. But also, there's this huge surge now of new or temporary homeschoolers, at least for the foreseeable next few months. And they're asking for help. So homeschool moms who've dealt with their own kids are now being asked by neighbors and friends and family, how do I do this? So there's this overwhelming pressure on many homeschool parents, on all the homeschool organizations, local, provincial, national, right across the country, with tens of thousands of families looking for alternatives.
Yeah, and I think, you know, when families are accustomed to having the government deliver their education in a school institutional setting, to have that sort of removed from them and having to rethink their model of delivery of education within their home or elsewhere is definitely an adjustment. We're going to talk a bit more about that, though, when we come back for this break, so stick around. Welcome back. We're discussing the return to school in the fall and what education and its delivery will look like. Dr. Scott Masson is joining me here, as well as Peter Stock. Scott, parents are kind of raising alarm bells. Students are a little bit anxious about the return to school, but teachers' unions across the country have also raised concerns with the return to school. There has been suggestion that class sizes ought to be reduced if they haven't already, especially during this time. Would reducing class sizes actually help relieve anxiety? Would it actually help, abate the spread of COVID?
I don't see how it does anything effective towards any of those measures. No, there are arguments to be made in terms of making class sizes smaller on an educational front, and I'm supportive of those to some degree. But I don't see how those have any relation to effectively combating the spread of COVID. It seems to me a non sequitur.
And Peter, any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I think it's exactly the wrong direction to go. What they're doing in the high schools in Ontario, for example, where they're saying to kids, you only come for half the week now, and the teachers have classes that are half the size. Well, that means the kids are only getting half the teacher instruction time they would have previously. So that's not the same education they were receiving in previous years. It's not an adequate delivery.
Now, I know, Peter, that some governments in Canada have been complaining that they think the teachers' unions are actually taking advantage of this pandemic to achieve some of their bargaining goals, reduction of class sizes, reduction in work hours. Do you feel this is the case?
Well, I can't say what their true justifications are, but I think based on what we've seen of teachers' unions in the past in Canada, they're very aggressive, and they really haven't omitted any opportunity to advocate for their particular goals.
Scott, any thoughts on that?
Well, I thought the same thing. It's the one of the talking points or explicit goals of the teachers' unions over the years to reduce class sizes and to increase the numbers of their employees that will pay into their pension plan and so forth. Despite the fact that the numbers of children are reducing across the board. So if anything, there ought to be fewer schools and fewer teachers and some sort of rationalization of resources, but there's been pushes for increased pay and increased numbers and smaller classes, etc. So I don't know what the motivation is, but it certainly does seem to be in sync with what had happened before.
Now, I understand what you're saying, because demographically, yes, we have had a reduction in the number of children, I suppose, being born and those entering the schools, or maybe they're opting for private education and whatnot in a non-COVID setting. I've heard now this fall that, in fact, there are teachers being laid off because in certain provinces, you've had to sort of declare in advance what your intention is for the school year. Will you be starting in September or not? Will you be sending your children to school or not? And as a result of the reduced enrollment, because some parents are electing not to send them to school, maybe to homeschool them or send them elsewhere, teachers have had to be laid off because, in fact, there are now even fewer children enrolled for the fall.
Well, that I would have thought that that's an obvious thing to happen if that's the case. I mean, if there are no children, what's the need for the teacher? They're going to rationalize their resources, and teachers are going to get laid off because of the policies. There's just a total lack of realism across the board, from the government to the education bodies, on how to tackle the current situation, in part because they've tried to deal with everything in a centralized fashion. They have not left the power of decision making to families and to those at the. I've talked to you about this on this show before, about the principle of simply allowing the authority of the family to make decisions for families, and rather than doing everything from on high, and let alone, why are healthcare professionals making decisions on behalf of families in the family jurisdiction? Why are they making it in the employment jurisdiction? It just makes no sense to me. It's a war on rationality as much as anything. It's a crazy response.
Peter, do you share that same sentiment?
Yeah, and just going back to the school boards and the teachers and the number of employees needed in the schools, we're aware of school boards across the country that have actually been calling those families who are registered to home educate and trying to pressure them to return to the public schools because their enrollment has dropped so much. They're actively going through those lists and calling families.
Wow, that's interesting, because I know in some jurisdictions, again, every province differs with its regulation, but in some provinces, homeschooling families are required or encouraged to file with their Ministry of Education that they actually do homeschool. They're supposed to declare. So we'll have to see how that mechanism will play out in the time of COVID. But stick around, we have to take a break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're discussing schooling in COVID, what the return to classrooms will look like if you're in fact returning to classrooms this fall. Joining me is Dr. Scott Masson and Peter Stock from homeschool.today. Some provinces have mandated that masks, like a facial covering for students, be worn in the classroom. So not just teachers, but students as well. In those provinces, there are exemptions for children with medical conditions, and in some provinces, only certain grades are encouraged or required to wear masks. So the policies differ province to province, board to board. How will this patchy application of masking help reduce the spread of COVID, if that's the intent here with the masking rules? Peter, do you want to start with us with that?
Sure. I think the first thing to say is that there is no scientific evidence at this point that masks work. Common sense would seem to indicate that, at least for adults, masks may help reduce the spread of COVID in some closed settings, indoors, etc. But for kids, I think the opposite may actually be true. Kids are active. They touch things, they touch their mask, they're moving their mask around, they're touching other people and other objects. And, the idea that somehow you can put a bunch of kids together in a room, even older kids, quite frankly, in a room and in a social setting and not have contact and not have transmission of disease, I think is wishful thinking, quite frankly.
And Scott, you're based out of Toronto. The Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto did release a report suggesting that masks not be made mandatory at schools, that kids not wear masks for those under 18. But in Ontario, the province where the Hospital for Sick Children is, they now are saying that masks should be mandatory for grades 4+ across the province. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, and the TDSB has in fact said that they should be worn by all ages most recently. So my thoughts on this are that the report from Toronto Sick Kids Hospital was actually even more emphatic than you're suggesting there, because they said that the mask should not be worn, not only because they're not effective in preventing the spread of COVID, but they're actually harmful to the development of the child. They're harmful psychologically. They're harmful in terms of learning. There's all manner of demonstrable harm that comes from masking up. So there's no clear evidence, to repeat Peter's point, that this will slow the spread of COVID or let alone stop it. But there is demonstrable harm in wearing it. So my question is, where is the science? Will nobody stand up for science? And then the irony here, Tanya, is that the government says that they're following the health professionals on this. Now, obviously, there is a disagreement amongst the health professionals on this front. But when you listen to the health professionals and you look at what they even say, whether it's the World Health Organization or any other, they're flip-flopping on their own reports and evidence as recently as a few months ago. So it seems to me that this is being pushed by a sense of fear and anxiety. The government has now spent billions, if not trillions, on preventing the spread of COVID, and they simply have to keep on doing it no matter how irrational and how destructive the consequences are. And nobody is willing to pull back from it.
But let me challenge you on that, Scott. I was speaking with a medical professional just the other day, and they said, while there may not be necessarily a medical advantage or disadvantage to wearing a mask, and that obviously is up for debate, They said psychologically it will serve as a reminder to children and students. It'll be a visible reminder to them in the classroom that, hey, there's something going on. We have to be extra careful. We have to wash our hands more often. You know, it's sort of like that. It'll psychologically remind them that they need to behave differently right now during this pandemic. Do you see merit in that?
Sure, I think there's a great deal of merit of crying fire in a crowded theater, and you just keep on doing it because it's very effective, isn't it? No, I mean, it creates unintended, terrible psychological consequences. People need to wear masks, not because they're effective. Like I'm just following and ridiculing the position that you just presented to me. They have to wear masks to be reminded of the need to wear masks and to wash their hands. It's a ridiculous policy. And how about the plexiglass that they're going to install between children and the masks that the people are going to, just to remind them that they need to do this, and the money, and no, it's insane.
Peter,
I can't believe a healthcare professional actually said that.
Peter, in the 20 seconds, your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, and I take it a step further and just say, even no matter what they try to do within the schools, as soon as the kids get outside the doors, and especially the teenagers, they're going to be over at friends' houses. They're going to be playing in the streets together. If there's going to be a spread of disease, it's going to happen. And none of these policies are going to make a whit of difference, in my view.
Welcome back. We're picking up where we left off on our discussion on the return to schooling this fall and what that's going to look like for students and families across the country. Peter, you're from homeschooling.today. I want to talk more about homeschooling. It seems that many more parents, as we mentioned, are turning to home education, or either partnering up in one's home or hiring a tutor to homeschool their children in their own home, or merging and making these like homeschooling pods with families. What have you heard? Is this the case?
Yeah, I think parents are looking at a great range of alternatives in that regard. There is a great deal of concern, as we've already talked about sending the kids back into the public setting, or quite frankly, even into private schools for the same reasons. And so, yeah, we're expecting to see a huge surge in the number of families that are actually home educating. Some of them are going to be temporary for sure, maybe only for the next few months or this school year. But others are discovering, or maybe already have discovered through the spring when we had the lockdown, that homeschooling is something that can work for their family. And I'll just add this point, with the increase in the number of parents who are now able to work remotely, maybe due to changes in company policies and because of the lockdown, there is more flexibility for a lot of families to continue with home education into the future.
And Scott, just jumping off that, what do you believe is the ideal solution to education within this climate? How do you think the government should respond? And how do you think they should even deliver the education?
I think they should liberalize the delivery modes. They ought to pull back on the one-size-fits-all education model that particularly operates within the province of Ontario, that they ought to consider charter schools, homeschooling, support, financial support, rethinking the necessity of everyone paying for the public system. I think these events have actually brought about a transformation, and it's not yet been acknowledged in the public square, but a transformation in the way in which education is going to be delivered, not just now, but going forward. I don't see how the genie's not going to go back into the bottle on this. The technology allows for remote delivery, as you suggest. Doing that in a home environment presents many advantages to families as well. So I do think that this is going to transform education. And maybe that's intentional on some people's part, but maybe their intention for it is to, get more, as the teacher, we talked about the teachers union, maybe they see this as an opportunity to advance their interests. It may, in fact, end up doing the exact opposite. And that's what I would expect would happen.
That's an interesting point. Peter, do you think that this is an opportunity for more power to the parents, that they're going to now drive the educational decisions where they may have been a bit more lax previously?
Yeah, I think there's been a fundamental shift in thinking, and the lockdown is when it happened, actually, because parents suddenly realized a couple of really key things. First of all, the education system wasn't what they thought it was. It's vulnerable on a number of levels. Even online education offered by teachers isn't as good as what parents can do in the home. And I think they also recognized this is sort of a tough lesson, but they recognize that there's a lot of hard work that goes into education if they're going to do it themselves. Some parents don't want that, and that's understandable. Others have recognized, you know what, I can do this. It's a lot of work, but I can do this. I didn't think I could. And so people now understand what home education is all about. They didn't before. And so that's fundamentally changed in our system. And everybody now knows that that is an option. It wasn't before.
Okay, in that half a minute we have left, any predictions for the future of the school year? Will it be locked down again? Is this actually going to work? Peter, in 10 seconds, your thoughts?
Well, I think we're looking at a bit of chaos, quite frankly. But if people want to know how to get started homeschooling, just come to our website, homeschool.today, and they can learn how to get started.
Scott, any closing thoughts on what the school year will look like? Will we be locked down again?
Yes, I think we will. It's being predicted. I think that there is pressure, as I said, politically and otherwise, for there to be an immediate response to any possible spike, any sort of news of a new outbreak. So I think that they will immediately do so to be consistent with what they've already done.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, both for your time today. This has been a fascinating discussion. This topic encompasses not just students and their education, but also parental rights and what role parents play in determining the future of their children's education, and not in any normal time, but in the time of a pandemic. Will there be a second spike? Will the schools be locked down again? I don't know. But what I do know is that many parents have shifted from a typical education delivery model of institutional learning and have now elected to do it in their home. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.